In the next few minutes, I'll show you what a certificate actually is, why a public key alone is not enough, the chain of trust that lets your browser believe a website it's never seen before, where root certificate authorities come from, and why your operating system already trusts a few hundred of them, what's literally inside a certificate file, how a browser validates a chain in a fraction of a second, what happens when a certificate authority gets compromised, and how Let's Encrypt quietly turned every website on the internet into HTTPS. Welcome to Defense Stack. We produce one concept a day, and each one stacks on the last, building the framework for security together. Let's dive into certificates. Episode 4 ended on a problem. Signatures prove that whoever holds a specific private key signed a specific message, but they don't prove the public key actually belongs to who it claims. If Eve generates a key pair and labels the public key as Google's, every signature she produces will verify perfectly against her own public key, even though she's not Google. The math is honest. The naming is the weak link. To fix this, we need a trusted third party who can vouch that a specific public key actually belongs to a specific real-world identity. That third party is called a certificate authority. The vouching happens in the form of a certificate. A certificate is just three things wrapped together. First, the subject, the identity being asserted, usually a domain name like google.com or an email address or a company name. Second, the public key that allegedly belongs to that subject. Third, and this is the part that makes the whole thing work, a signature from a certificate authority over the first two. The CA is essentially saying, I have verified that this public key really belongs to this identity, and here's my signature to prove I vouched for it. Anyone in the world can verify the CA's signature using the CA's public key. If the signature is valid, the binding is real. Here's where it gets layered. Real certificates aren't just signed by one authority. They're signed by a chain of authorities. At the top is a root CA, a small number of organizations whose certificates are baked into your operating system and your browser at install time. The root CA's job is to sit offline and sign a smaller number of intermediate certificates. Those intermediates do the day-to-day work of signing the actual website certificates that your browser eventually sees. So when you connect to google.com, the chain you verify is google.com certificate, signed by an intermediate CA, signed by a root CA your OS already trusts. 3 signatures, 3 verifications, all using the math from episode 4. The root certificate authorities are the trust anchors of the entire system. Your operating system and your browser ship with a curated list of root certificates already installed. Apple maintains the list for macOS and iOS. Microsoft maintains it for Windows. Google maintains it for Chrome and Android. Mozilla maintains an independent list used by Firefox and many Linux distributions. There are around 100 to 200 roots across all the major trust stores. Names you'd recognize include DigiCert, GlobalSign, GoDaddy, Sectago, and the ISRG root that backs Let's Encrypt. Becoming a new root CA requires extensive audits and takes years. It's a high-trust, high-scrutiny position, because once you're a root, every machine in the world implicitly believes anything you sign. The wire format every certificate uses is called X2509. When you click the lock icon in your browser and inspect a certificate, you're looking at parsed X509. The fields that matter: subject, telling you who the cert is for; issuer, telling you which intermediate CA signed it; validity period, with a not before and not after date. Modern TLS certificates max out at 90 days, after which they expire and need to be renewed. Public key, with the algorithm and the actual bytes. Subject alternative names, listing every domain the cert covers. This is how one cert can secure both google.com and youtube.com. And finally, the signature itself, computed over everything else. When your browser opens an HTTPS connection, the server hands it the leaf certificate plus any intermediates needed to reach a root. The browser runs 4 checks. First, every certificate in the chain has a valid signature from the certificate above it, all the way up. Second, the top of the chain is a root your operating system already trusts. If the chain ends somewhere unexpected, the connection fails. Third, every certificate is currently within its validity window, not expired and not yet active. Fourth, The leaf certificate's subject actually matches the domain you typed into the address bar. If any one of those checks fails, the browser shows a big red warning and refuses to connect. There is no partial trust. The whole system relies on root C as being trustworthy. When one isn't, the consequences are immediate. The most famous example is DigiNotar in 2011. Attackers breached a Dutch CA and issued roughly 500 fraudulent certificates, including one for Google.com that was used to intercept Iranian Gmail traffic. Once the breach was discovered, every major browser and operating system removed DigiNotar from its trust stores within weeks, and the company went bankrupt within months. This is the system's defense mechanism. If a CA misbehaves or is compromised, it gets removed from every trust store on Earth, and every certificate it ever issued instantly becomes untrusted. That's a brutal accountability mechanism, and it's why being a CA is a legitimate business with regular audits. Until 2016, getting a TLS certificate was expensive and manual. You filled out forms, you paid $50 to $500 a year per domain, you waited for emails. About 30% of web traffic was HTTPS, mostly for banks and login pages. Then Let's Encrypt launched as a non-profit CA with one mission: make TLS certificates free and automated. They invented a protocol called ACME that lets your server prove domain ownership and get a cert issued in seconds, with no human in the loop, all via API. Within a few years, more than 95% of web traffic became HTTPS, and HTTPS became the default for every new website. Let's Encrypt is now one of the most used CAs on the internet. There's one more piece of how trust actually works in modern PKI. After the DigiNotar incident we just talked about, the industry realized that even legitimate CAs can be coerced or compromised, and there was no way to catch it until someone got attacked. The fix is called certificate transparency. Every certificate issued by a publicly trusted CA must now be submitted to public append-only logs run by independent parties: Google, Cloudflare, Let's Encrypt itself, and others. Browsers refuse to trust certificates that don't appear in these logs. The result is that any certificate ever issued for any domain is publicly visible. If a CA issues a fraudulent certificate for your bank tomorrow, the certificate appears in the public log within minutes. Your bank's security team gets an alert. The certificate gets revoked before damage is done. The transparency logs turn private CA misbehavior into public evidence. That's the end of this concept, but each video stacks on the last. Subscribe and we add the next layer tomorrow. So that's certificates. The exploit 509 binding of an identity to a public key signed by a chain of authorities that traces back to roots your machine shipped with. The CA system that holds it all together, the brutal accountability mechanism when a CA misbehaves, and the Let's Encrypt revolution that turned HTTPS from a luxury into a default. 5 episodes in, we now have every primitive the modern web depends on. Tomorrow, we put them all together in one of the most important protocols ever designed. Thanks for watching.